Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about various releases that have caught my attention, and indeed the attention of a great deal of watch collectors, and discuss my opinions of them, and really my general thoughts. But before I start, I would like to apologise for any background noise you may be hearing. It's raining extremely heavily outside, and I've tried to minimise the noise as best I can, but sadly it's been difficult to remove altogether, so please do bear with me. Now the first watch I'd like to talk about is one which has been discussed really extensively on a number of YouTube channels, and indeed a lot of journalists have talked about this as well. And this is the new Heuer Carrera Skipper, designed for and by Hodinkee. Of course, Hodinkee are a very well-known, and probably the most well-known, or among the most well-known, of the horological websites. And I think they really do often try to collaborate with brands to produce interesting pieces. Usually, though, like a lot of other people, I haven't been particularly keen on their creations, but I must say this most recent one is truly a very, very interesting piece, and this really has been demonstrated by the fact that all 125 of them have been sold already. But to better understand this watch, and before I discuss the watch itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the watch, to better understand it. Now, the history of the Skipper is in fact rather interesting, and the watch you now see on the screen is a watch that was released in 1968, to celebrate the win of the America's Cup by a ship called the Intrepid. And this was a very innovative ship. It was one of the early versions with a rudder that was separate from the keel and various other innovations that really did produce a far faster boat. But this was made by Heuer to commemorate this win, and was indeed designed as a sort of a watch for those who needed to use a watch for indeed sailing and timing regattas and so on. Hence the three parts to the subdial, which became very famous in this Skipper design. And the original Skipper was made in both Carrera and Ortavia setups, with those typical colours on the dial, and also on the subdials with that beautiful sunburst dial, and that light blue colour for the subdials, as well as the orange and the green. And the reason why that light blue was chosen was because it matched the deck of the Intrepid. And the very reason why this watch had that colour, and why the Intrepid had that colour, was that, as proven by MIT, this colour was the one that was least likely to produce glare that would distract the sailors. So as a result, there really is some technology going into this watch, and a great deal of history. And this particular model is the reference 7754, and has become one of the most collectible Heuer Carreras there are, with less than 20 pieces known to exist in the world. Now, before I talk about the modern watch, one other watch has been mixed into this, because Hodinkee have made a point of making a watch that isn't a recreation, but rather an inspiration, and they make a very clear point of that on their website. But they've also taken inspiration from another version of the Carrera called the Dato 45, or the reference 3147. And this is again a very rare reference, which happens to have the date on one side of the dial at 9 o'clock in this configuration, and then a 45-minute counter on the other side. And this was the inspiration for the layout of the new version, to not make the new watch a sort of a recreation or a replica, but rather just an inspired and very curious piece from the brand. And incidentally, the modern incarnation doesn't actually have any TAG Heuer branding on it at all. It's entirely branded Heuer. So the watch you now see on the screen is the modern recreation, or rather inspired piece, designed in conjunction with Hodinkee via TAG Heuer. And as you can see, it follows that colour layout of the 7754, or the Skipper as it became known, while also taking into account the design in terms of dial layout of that 3147, or the Dato 45. Except that in this case it's inverted, so you have the date in a much easier to read position at 3 o'clock. Now, in terms of other changes from the original, one now has a boxed sapphire crystal rather than the original style of acrylic, which does make it much more durable, as well as having a slightly larger case at 39mm rather than 35, and a lug width of 19mm. Now, the movement that provides this rather interesting layout underneath that beautiful dark blue and sunburst finished dial, one has the caliber 18 from TAG Heuer, but in this case branded entirely as a Heuer rather than a TAG Heuer. And in order to install that chronograph module on the top, that's actually been produced by Dubois de Pras, who also produce a great deal of modules, notably the various versions used by Omega at times, and indeed the Squale Master also had a module placed on top of it made by this brand. So they really do have a very substantial history. And of course, because it's a sailing watch, this watch is water resistant to 100 metres. Now, the price for this watch comes in at around the $6,000 mark, and the watch is limited to only 125 pieces, of which all have already sold. So, of course, it is a somewhat a strange topic to discuss, seeing as one can't actually buy this watch. But I thought it would be interesting to discuss this, and also please do leave your comments down below about this particular piece, especially, because I'm very curious to hear what you think about a watch of this nature. Personally, I think it's rather a nice idea, especially for the long-term collector. And I don't believe that with its caliber 18 and Dubois de Praia module, it's really worth the $6,000 mark. But nonetheless, I do feel that for the collector, I think it's a fairly reasonable watch to own, and especially at the level of exclusivity this watch sits at, since it will really be bought by old collectors of Heuer as a sort of a more modern option. So certainly it's an interesting piece, but do please tell me what you think of this, because I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Now, the next watch I'd like to talk about is rather a curious release from Longines, and this is the flagship Heritage by Kate Winslet. And that may strike you as a strange title for the watch, but effectively this is a watch that has been designed to the specifications of their brand ambassador, Kate Winslet. And this is a watch which is a 35mm dress watch in 18-karat gold, with a very, very elegant dial, which is has a sort of an Art Deco flair to it, with a matte section in the centre, again with applied indices, and all polished beautifully, as well as an applied Longines logo. But of course this does follow the lines of the original flagship, though it does take certain liberties with the specifications. And it's powered by effectively an ETA 2895-2, which is a movement which is a very respectable movement and has been modified by Longines quite often, really, for production in their watches. But it's the price of this watch that is really the mind-blowing section. This watch is for auction and starts at $25,000. Now, the reason why this watch is so expensive is that there are only 5 of them, and 2 are owned by Kate Winslet and Longines, and 3 of them are being auctioned for this very high price. And the reason for this is that the money, and this is the entirety of the money made from these watches, goes to the Golden Hat Foundation, which was or rather is, a foundation run by Kate Winslet that is in fact a charity for the autistic and autistic children. So it really is a very good cause that these watches are being made for. And I do appreciate the fact that all the money is going there, whereas often one has watches or products that send, say, 10% of their profit to a given charity, but here one really does have a real commitment with the full sum going to the charity. Of course, in terms of dial and case detailing, the watch is a very, very elegant piece, with an 18-karat gold case and then the matte and brush dial, again with those sub-seconds courtesy of the ETA movement in this watch, and also with very elegantly designed hands with lume in them, in this Dauphine style, which is very typical of Longines, and on that very, very tasteful cream-coloured strap. So it's certainly an interesting piece, and of course under normal circumstances it simply wouldn't be worth $25,000, but it does pay homage to the original flagships of 1957, which is again an interesting historical feature, and this watch is designed more to be a charitable piece than really a production watch in any format. And of course with the win of this watch one does get the ability to visit their factory, as well as 2 equestrian events with an all paid for travel. Now, the next watch in this list has a very interesting story behind it, and this is a new version of the Omega Seamaster. It's a limited edition made to commemorate several things, really. Now, to understand this watch, one has to remember that in the films You Only Live Twice, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Tomorrow Never Dies, Bond is presented wearing a naval uniform, and is presented as a naval commander. And these are celebrating their 50th, 40th and 20th anniversaries this year. So as a result, Omega, with their current association with the franchise making watches for Bond, have decided to make a limited edition in steel and then a much more limited version in gold of a Seamaster in the colours of a naval commander and all the paraphernalia they would have, their uniform, their medals and so on. In terms of specifications, the watch is pretty much identical to the standard one other than the colouring, in that one has a white enamel dial rather than the blue one on the standard version. Also, one has contrast blue painted hands to again contrast that background and make it a little bit more legible. And similarly, the numerals have similar outlines. The bezel is slightly different because it has an insert which is ceramic and is liquid metal like the standard one, except that now it has that rubber insert from 0 to 15, as we've seen on certain Planet Oceans in recent years, which is a way of applying a very bright red or orange in the case of those Planet Oceans colour to the bezel, which wouldn't be possible with normal ceramic. Now the caseback is rather interesting because gone is that closed caseback with the seahorse or hippocampus logo on the back, and instead we have an exhibition caseback with simply Commander's Watch and then the limited edition numbers at the bottom of 7007 or 007 if you're buying the gold version. But I'll talk about the gold version just when I'm talking about the pricing. But the movement is their 2507, which is one of their older coaxial movements, but it's still nothing to be scoffed at. And it's decorated in a very un-Omega way, at least today, because it has very traditional decoration with Côte de Genève lines and also perlage, which isn't something they usually go in for these days. They go for a more modern aesthetic, but I think it's very fitting to this watch. And that rotor is really the pièce de résistance of this watch, with those 3 lines going across it to denote the rank, and then the 9mm section in the centre denoting the back end of a 9mm bullet, which is the round of choice for Bond, though of course in the early films he would have used a 32 ACP. The 9mm quickly became the round used almost unilaterally. The presentation of the watch is rather interesting because it comes in a medal-style box, so it's a flat box rather than having a usual large watch case. And it presents the watch placed flat with a regimental-style NATO, with those colours again represented. And this is mirrored by a little naval pin that's presented by the side of it, that can be worn with the watch, although I doubt very many people will do that. Of course, the watch does still come with the bracelet with 007 on the clasp, and also with a watch strap changing tool as well, which is always a useful thing to have, because it means you really are using the right piece of equipment for those particular gaps in the bracelet, because often one finds that one can't get an aftermarket strap replacement tool into the gap given for bracelet changes, so it's nice to see that it's included here. Now the pricing has only been released for the gold version in Swiss francs, so I'll give both prices in Swiss francs. The steel version comes in at 4,650 Swiss francs, which is around £3,700, and the gold version is 28,000 Swiss francs rather, which is near around the £25,000 mark. So really an immense price increase there, and of course there will only be 7 gold versions made. But I personally would rather the steel if I was going to have either of these watches, just because I feel the gold is really not in keeping with the Bond style of watches. Now the next watch I'd like to talk about is a new release from IWC, and this is a new re-edition of the Mark 11 pilot's watch. And this is a watch which was originally commissioned in 1948 by the Royal Air Force to be produced specifically for pilots and navigators as a very legible timepiece, which was originally made by JLC and IWC, but by the 1950s only IWC were producing it as the RAF decided to stop sourcing them from JLC. And these watches have become really an iconic timepiece as far as pilots' watches go, with their very minimalistic and extremely legible aesthetic, and very simple general case design. Of course, these watches do hold a great deal of a role in the IWC history, since they were produced through until 1994, until IWC started to produce the successor to this watch, and various civilian versions with a more dressy dial orientation, and also a far more simple aesthetic than this very clear and legible military style of display. And IWC have decided to produce a re-edition of this in order to commemorate it and also really to play into the fact that vintage watches have taken such an increase in terms of their success recently. And this is also proven by the success of models in their very lineup from the Big Pilot and its various versions. Now, the new version of this watch features very similar aesthetics really to the original, with those very squared-off hands, very sharp hand aesthetics, although in this case the second hand is simply polished rather than painted white as was the case with the original. Also, they've stuck to the original loom format of having loom at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and not at any other point on the dial other than the minute and hour hands. So there is a great deal of care taken to remain fairly true to the original. One change, though, is the fact that this version now does also have a date wheel, though it's been put in fairly discreetly with a black date wheel rather than having a white version of that, which would stand out rather a lot more than this. And I do feel that this is probably a lot more legible as well. And I also like the fact that IWC have really held off with the writing on the dial, simply having the IWC branding at the 12 o'clock position, automatic and Swiss, which I think leaves the watch fairly bare and does give it a certain military aesthetic. Now, the case of the watch is very moderately sized because it is based on their more modern versions of the Mark series of IWC models. So the case is 40mm in diameter with a very nice curve to it and a fully brushed finish, which again harks back to that military aesthetic. And the case is stainless steel and is only 10.8mm thick, which is reasonably fair really for a watch with a fairly sloped bezel on its edge around that crystal. Now, one aspect of this watch that I'm very, very pleased to see has remained from previous pilot's watches from IWC is that it has a soft iron core, which means that you have this anti-magnetic property that protects the movement from strong magnetic fields, because as we know, magnetic fields cause real problems really with movements. So that certainly is an advantage to this watch, and one which I'm very glad IWC kept in this watch. And talking about the movement, really the movement inside the watch is the IWC caliber 35111, and this is effectively a Sellita SW300, which is their higher end model from Sellita, which competes with the ETA 2892 and other versions in that line, and certainly is an excellent movement, though I must say for the price of €4,790. I do think IWC are asking a lot, considering that Omega are going to be releasing their standard production version of the Railmaster, which has their coaxial in-house movement. So that certainly is something to consider. But for those who are great fans of the IWC Pilot line, this certainly will be a nice watch to see. Now, one funny aspect about this watch is the release style. So rather than being released everywhere effectively, and this is a limited edition of 1,948 pieces to commemorate the year of inception of this watch, but this watch is released for the first 3 months only in Harrods in London. So it'll be only available in England and for the first 3 months of its production, which is in July this year. So one has to wait 3 months after that to be able to access it anywhere else. So IWC have put an emphasis on the fact that it was a British watch, or a watch designed for British military forces. So I do sort of see the reasons why they did that, but I suspect this was more down to an agreement with Harrods than anything else. Now, the next watch I'd like to talk about, and indeed the final watch in this video, is a new version of the Grand Seiko Spring Drive 8-day power reserve. And this is a watch which I really adored in its original format in platinum, with a wonderful fully polished case with that very typical polishing technique that's used by Japanese brands and Seiko. That's a very traditional polishing technique to give an extremely smooth and reflective surface, really superior to other polishing techniques. And this is a wonderful matted and textured dial, and a beautiful level of fit and finish really on it, as well as a wonderfully beautiful movement. But there's a new version in pink gold, and the reference number is SBGD202. And this is really a wonderful reinterpretation of what was a very understated watch, in a far more bold and a very different style. Now, this watch certainly loses the understated elegance of the original, with this 43mm 18-carat pink gold case, which is a very, very bright piece, and I think is matched very well with that brown alligator leather strap. So it has changed quite substantially in terms of its appearance, and similarly the handset is again diamond cut, as are the indices, which are a very traditional Grand Seiko style on the dial, and offer some really fantastic finishing to give them the same reflection the case has. But this certainly does present a watch which is far less understated and simple than the original, that despite being 43mm, was remarkably subtle in its ways. But this watch, with its bright pink gold case, which is again polished and finished in a wonderful way and very similarly to the original, certainly does draw the eye more than the original. And the dial is really where one wants to draw one's attention with this particular piece, because while the rest of the case is very similar to the original, it now has pink gold indices and hands, which, as I've said, are diamond cut for a better finish. But also the dial is originally galvanically coated a sort of a black, and then over that layers of a very glossy black surface covering or varnish are applied, and then small specks of gold are embedded into the dial to provide the appearance of a night sky, which I think is a really wonderful approach and shows the playfulness that Grand Seiko are willing to undertake with their watches. Now, the case back of the watch is again very typical Grand Seiko, in that we have this very simple and understated finishing that actually requires immense amounts of work to clearly finish, and it's really in the details that Grand Seiko excel, and the same thing is true for this watch, where one has this single, rather flat and to many a very Spartan finish really to the case back, considering it has an open exhibition case back. This single plate is cut at the top to resemble a mountain, or I believe Mount Fuji, along with the jewels, which are placed specifically to look like the lights of the town where this watch is made at night, which is a really wonderful touch, and I think demonstrates the care that Grand Seiko are willing to put in to show the quality and really the attention that fans and lovers of the brand have come to expect. Otherwise, the case back is relatively simple, just denoting the 3 barrels, which are why the watch is so large, allowing 8 days of power reserve, shown on that power reserve indicator on the case back, which doesn't intrude into the dial space, but rather is shown from the back of the watch, so one can clearly monitor the winding of the watch and whether one needs to wind it or not before putting it on the wrist in the morning. The price of the watch is of course rather high at $42,700, which is still substantially less than the platinum version, but then that's what you would expect. But in terms of the craftsmanship, it really is shown by the fact that the workshop where these are made, just over 12 watchmakers who are these extremely senior master craftsmen, work continually and yet only produce about 24 watches a year. So that really does demonstrate the exclusivity and rarity that these pieces show, as well as the craftsmanship that goes into them. Anyway, I'll conclude the video here because I really have been going on about these watches, though I must say I do think some of the releases this month really do show a great deal of craftsmanship. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy the video and would like to see more content here on the channel. So also do please leave your comments down below as to what you thought of the various watches in the video and the various topics addressed, because I'm always interested to hear your opinions. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.